The lawyer's heavy fountain pen made a sharp scratching sound as he signed the final page of my father's estate documents, and the silence in the mahogany-walled room was so absolute you could hear the rain tapping against the high glass windows. Across the polished conference table, my older brother Brandon leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, smug smile spreading across his face as he adjusted his gold cufflinks. He didn't even try to hide his triumph. The lawyer had just finished reading the will of our late father, Thomas Vance, and according to the legal document, the entire historic 15-acre family estate, the main colonial house, and all the physical assets of our family's multi-million-dollar botanical nursery on the Oregon coast belonged solely to Brandon. Every cousin, aunt, and uncle in the room turned their eyes toward me, holding their breath, waiting for the tears to fall, waiting for the anger to erupt, or waiting for me to stand up and scream at the injustice of it all. For 6 long years, I was the one who lived in the small cottage on the property, waking up at 4 in the morning to manage the nursery, running the daily operations, and nursing my father through 2 debilitating strokes while managing his endless medications, doctor appointments, and daily therapy. Brandon had visited exactly 3 times in those 6 years, usually arriving in a rented sports car, staying for dinner, complaining about the damp coastal weather, and leaving before the breakfast dishes were even washed. Yet, on paper, Brandon had won everything, and I was left with nothing but the clothes on my back and the memories of my sacrifice. I looked at my brother's mocking smile, then I looked at the pitying faces of our relatives. Instead of crying, I felt a strange, quiet calm wash over me. I reached into my leather purse, pulled out a heavy, wax-sealed cream envelope, and slid it gently across the polished table, stopping it right in front of the lawyer. "Before we conclude today's meeting," I said, my voice steady and clear, "Dad asked me to hand this to you the moment the will was officially read." That was the exact second Brandon's smile began to wither. My name is Evelyn Vance, and I was 37 years old when I realized that some of the greatest battles in life are won not with loud arguments, but with the quiet power of earned trust. For 6 years, my entire world revolved around Vance Heritage Nursery and the fragile health of my father. When his first stroke happened, Brandon was on a yacht in the Mediterranean, sending a text message that read, "Praying for Dad, let me know if things get worse." I was the one who sat in the sterile hospital corridor for 48 hours, drinking terrible vending machine coffee, speaking with the neurologists, and coordinating his post-stroke rehabilitation. When we finally brought Dad home, he couldn't walk without assistance. His speech was slurred, and the once vibrant landscape architect who had spent his life breeding rare, award-winning hybrid roses was confined to a wheelchair, staring out at the foggy coastline. Brandon returned to his high-paying corporate consulting job in Chicago, occasionally calling on Sunday afternoons to ask if the nursery's quarterly revenues could cover his portion of the family trust's upkeep. I didn't complain. I rolled up my sleeves, learned how to manage a commercial botanical business under pressure, handled the payroll for our 15 loyal employees, and spent my evenings gently massaging my father's hands, helping him regain his fine motor skills by practicing grafting techniques on young rose stems. I canceled my own dreams of traveling, turned down a lucrative offer to manage a major botanical garden in California, and watched my personal life quietly fade into the background because my father needed me. I did it out of love, but the physical and emotional exhaustion was a heavy weight I carried alone in the quiet coastal nights. If you have ever been the person who quietly kept the entire ship from sinking while others took credit for the smooth sailing, drop a comment saying, "I am standing strong right now," and subscribe to the channel, because the legal storm that is about to hit this boardroom is a lesson in true emotional justice. My boyfriend David, who ran the local maritime supply shop, was the only one who saw the toll it was taking on me. He would often show up at the nursery's greenhouse at dusk, carrying hot soup and a thermos of tea, silently helping me close the heavy glass vents and secure the heating systems before the coastal frost rolled in. He never once told me to abandon my father, but he constantly reminded me that my value was not determined by my family's willingness to acknowledge it. 3 months before my father passed away, he called me into his study late one night. The room smelled of old paper, dried lavender, and the faint, earthy scent of soil that he always carried on his clothes. He looked at me with his clear blue eyes, took my hand in his rough, calloused palm, and whispered, "Evelyn, you have given this land your heart and you have given me my dignity. Never forget that the real value of a tree is not in its branches that everyone sees, but in the roots that hold it to the earth." I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time. I just squeezed his hand and told him to rest. When he passed away peacefully on a misty Tuesday morning, I was the one holding his hand, whispering that his roses would always bloom. The funeral was a beautiful tribute to his life, attended by hundreds of local gardeners, botanists, and neighbors whom he had helped over the decades. Brandon arrived late wearing a custom-tailored black suit, looking more like an executive attending a corporate merger than a grieving son. After the service, he immediately began asking about the valuation of the property, dropping hints about a luxury condominium developer who had been scouting the Oregon coast for prime land. A week later, we were gathered in the offices of Abernathy and Associates for the reading of the estate. Brandon sat with his arms crossed, radiating an aura of absolute ownership. As the attorney read the words that officially handed the historic 15-acre property, the grand family home, and the physical nursery buildings to Brandon, my brother exhaled a long, satisfied sigh. The relatives looked at me with sympathetic, embarrassed glances, expecting me to break down. Across the table, Brandon's eyes met mine, filled with a cold, mocking pity. "I'm sure you can find a nice apartment in town, Evelyn," he murmured, loud enough for the room to hear. "Of course, I'll give you a few weeks to pack up your things from the cottage." That was when I reached into my purse and slid the wax-sealed envelope to the lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. The attorney paused, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the seal, which bore my father's unique botanical press stamp. On the front, written in Thomas Vance's steady, elegant cursive, were the words, "To be opened only by my executor in the presence of my children after my primary will has been read." Mr. Abernathy broke the wax with a silver letter opener, unfolded the heavy parchment paper, and began to read aloud, his voice echoing in the silent room. "To my son Brandon and my daughter Evelyn. If you are reading this, Brandon is likely celebrating his new status as the sole owner of the Vance family estate and the physical nursery. Brandon, you have always had an eye for high prices, luxury, and immediate returns. You viewed my land not as a living legacy, but as a transaction waiting to be completed. Therefore, I have given you exactly what your heart desired, the deed to the physical land and the structures upon it." Brandon's smirk widened slightly, though a flicker of confusion crossed his eyes. The lawyer turned the page, and his professional, calm demeanor suddenly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. He cleared his throat, leaned forward, and continued reading. "However, Brandon, what you do not know is that 6 months ago I quietly partnered with the Oregon Land Trust to place a permanent, legally binding conservation easement over the entire 15 acres of the Vance estate. Under this easement, which is registered with the state and cannot be altered, revoked, or canceled by any future owner, the land is legally restricted to agricultural and botanical use only in perpetuity. It can never be subdivided, it can never be developed for commercial housing, and no condominiums can ever be built upon it." Brandon's face instantly drained of all color. He sat bolt upright in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. "What? No, that's impossible. He can't do that," he gasped, his voice cracking with sudden panic. The lawyer didn't stop. He turned to the next section of the letter. "Because the land can never be developed, its market value for real estate is virtually zero, meaning you cannot sell it to developers, and you will be responsible for the high agricultural property taxes and maintenance of the historic structures out of your own pocket. Now, let us speak of the actual business." The room was so quiet you could hear the rapid, shallow breathing of my brother. The name Vance Heritage Nursery, the trademark, the extensive client database, and most importantly, the international patents for the 24 unique hybrid rose and orchid varieties I developed over 40 years, which generate over $600,000 annually in licensing royalties alone, do not belong to the physical estate. They are intellectual property. 7 years ago, I established the Eleanor Vance Botanical Trust, named after your late mother. The sole trustee, sole manager, and 100% controlling beneficiary of this trust is my daughter, Evelyn. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming gratitude. My father had seen everything. He had seen the early mornings, the late nights, the mud on my boots, and the love in my heart. He knew that if he left the land unprotected, Brandon would destroy his life's work for a quick paycheck. By placing the conservation easement, he saved the land he loved, and by giving me the intellectual property and the royalty trust, he ensured that I would have the financial freedom and the legal power to run the business on my own terms. The lawyer opened a secondary black folder, revealing the signed, notarized, and registered trust agreements, along with the patent certifications. Everything was legally airtight, drafted by a specialized maritime and agricultural estate firm months before Dad's passing. Brandon stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "This is a setup. She manipulated him. Dad was old, his brain was damaged from the strokes. I will sue to break this trust. I will drag this through every court in the state," he screamed, his polished executive facade completely shattering. Mr. Abernathy looked up from the documents, his expression cold and unimpressed. "Mr. Vance, I personally conducted the mental competency evaluations with your father, alongside 2 independent neurologists, before these documents were signed and notarized. His mind was perfectly clear. He knew exactly what he was doing. Legally, you own a beautiful, historic 15-acre property that you can never build on, which will cost you tens of thousands of dollars annually in upkeep, while your sister owns the entire business, the brand, the patents, and the millions in royalty funds that support it." Brandon looked at me, his eyes wild with anger and desperation. "Evelyn, please, you can't do this to me. We're family. We can split the royalty funds. I'll let you run the nursery. You can stay in the cottage forever." I looked at my brother, the man who just 10 minutes ago had told me to pack my bags and find an apartment in town. I didn't feel anger toward him, only a profound, clean sense of closure. I stood up, picked up my purse, and looked him in the eye. "My place was always here, Brandon. I held this foundation up while you were looking for a way to tear it down. I won't split the royalties, but I will make you an offer. Since you cannot afford the property taxes and maintenance on a restricted agricultural estate, my botanical trust will lease the land from you for a fair agricultural rate. You will get enough to cover your taxes, and the nursery will continue to grow in the soil where Dad planted it, but you will never have a say in how this legacy is run." Brandon slowly sank back into his chair, completely defeated, realizing that the sister he had dismissed as just a laborer now held the keys to his financial survival. I walked out of the law office and into the cool, fresh Oregon rain, feeling lighter than I had in years. David was waiting for me in his truck, the engine idling warmly. As I climbed into the passenger seat, he didn't ask about the money or the land. He just looked at my face, smiled, and handed me a warm cup of coffee. "Let's go home, Evelyn," he said softly. Over the next year, the transition was seamless. My father's roses continued to bloom, their sweet fragrance filling the coastal air. The local community, the nursery staff, and our loyal clients rallied around us, knowing that the heart of Vance Heritage Nursery was still beating strong. Brandon accepted the lease agreement, living in Chicago on his corporate salary, quietly collecting his modest rent checks, while the land he tried to sell remained green, protected, and beautiful forever. I realized then that my father's final lesson was the most valuable one of all. Wealth can be inherited by anyone with a name on a deed, but the true inheritance of a life, the trust, the respect, and the love of a community, must be built with your own 2 hands. If you take one thing from my journey, let it be this: never apologize for your quiet strength, and never let ungrateful people make you feel small. Keep building, keep caring, and keep showing up, because when the mist finally clears, the ground you chose to stand on will be the only thing left holding you up. Thank you for listening to my story on Calm Drama Stories. Don't forget to comment. I am standing strong. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe for the next story of quiet justice.